Good morning. 2 weeks ago, we started a new series called Table Talk, and the whole idea is they're looking at different events, scenes that happen around tables in the Bible. We looked at Joseph and his gathering with his brothers around the table, and when he revealed himself to them and talked about reconciliation. Last week we looked at Daniel, and it came down to a simple choice, which turned out to be pretty profound. What's he going to eat for lunch? And he had to make that choice of commitment. Is he going to follow the ways that everybody else was going, or was he going to stand firm in what he believed and what he was taught about the ways of God? Well, today we have another table in front of us, and the table this morning is blank, but we're going to look at a table scene. But actually I set this table up for a illustration. There was a guy that was a professor that was teaching a class on time management in a college class. And for time's sake, I did this ahead of. But he took this and he put this big jar and he filled these big rocks in it. And he looked at his students and said, all right, is the jar full? And they kind of, well, some of them said, yeah. Some of them said, no. Some said, I'm not sure. He said, okay. And then he pulled out another bucket and started putting in more rocks. Someone's making a mess up here. Shook those down, hoping that his students were getting the point. And he filled it up to the top. We'll just do it this way. I got to put these back in the driveway out here in the church, so make sure I get all of those in there. And he said to his students, all right, is the jar filled now? And they were kind of getting on, and they said, no, we don't think so. He said, all right, very good. And then he took out a bucket of sand and took the sand and really made a mess. And I'm in trouble because I need more sand for next service now. This is not one of these things you do and then I'll take it all back apart and do it. So he takes and he fills up the bucket, shakes it around, fills it to the top and says, all right, now is it full? And they all said, no. And he said, very good. Because then he took out some water. Now, if I was a magician, I'd make it all disappear, but I'm not. And he looked at his class and said, okay, what is the point of this illustration? One of the students had it, said, it proves that no matter how full your schedule is, you can always fit something else in it. And the professor said, no, that's not it at all. He said, the point of this illustration is this. If you don't put in the big rocks first, you'll never have room to fit them in. Think about that in life. If you don't take the things that are the most important, if you don't take the big rocks first, we may never be able to fit them in our lives. There's a story in the New Testament that is an interesting little story. It's a story about a dinner party. It was somewhat an unscheduled dinner party, but it's from Luke chapter 10. And it goes like this. You see it up there on the screen. As Jesus and the disciples continued on their way to Jerusalem, they came to a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed them into her home. Now, Jesus was Bethany is the town that Mary and Martha lived in, and it's about 2 miles from Jerusalem. He'd been teaching. The context of this story is right after one of the most well-known stories in the New Testament, the parable of the Good Samaritan. You probably have heard that story in a lot of different contexts. And Jesus leaves that teaching, and as they're going along the way, they go through Bethany, and they go and they knock on the door of Martha's house. Now remember, it wasn't just Jesus. It was Jesus and his disciples. We know there were at least 12 that traveled with him, and sometimes we find that there were others that would gather and travel with him also. But at least 13 people drop in for dinner and say, "Hi, what's for supper? How would you like that?" Right? And Martha, being the gracious host that she is, she just simply says, "Come on in." She made room for them, and then she got right to work. And then something interesting happens. The story goes on. Her sister, Mary, sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he taught. Now, this is Mary, but it's not Mary, the mother of Jesus. Just a side note here. It was found that Mary was one of the most common names in the times of Jesus for women. It was estimated 1 out of 5 women were actually named Mary. In the New Testament, we have record of 6 different Marys in the New Testament there. But this Mary was the sister of Martha. What the text also doesn't tell us is that they had a brother at home. You may have heard of him. His name is Lazarus. Lazarus appears in John chapter 11, makes front page news when he comes out of the grave after being in there 4 days. Jesus called him out of the grave. So that's the family. That's the group. And if you remember, Jesus, when he went to the graveside of Lazarus, shortest verse in the Bible, first Bible verse I ever memorized. You know what it is? Jesus wept. All right, that's why I can handle that Bible verse. All right, John 11:35. But what it shows is the close relationship that Jesus had with these people. It just wasn't, a passing, "Hi, how you doing?" type thing. He was almost like one in the family. Now make note what Mary's doing here. She sat at the Lord's feet and listened to this. Now hang on to that, because that becomes significant later on. So the scene is set. Jesus and the disciples, they all enter in. They get settled in. Jesus is kind of the center there, and they are probably reclining on the floor at his feet. And Mary sits down and decides that she's going to listen also. And then all of a sudden, there's a change in the tone in the house. But Martha was distracted by the big dinner she was preparing. She came to Jesus and said, "Lord, doesn't it seem unfair that my sister just sits there while I do all the work?" You knew they were really sisters at this point, all right? Okay? "Tell her to come and help me." Now, maybe Martha was just having one of those days. I don't know. Maybe something didn't sit well with her. Now, before we throw Martha under the bus, let's evaluate the scene here a little bit. How would you like to have over a dozen people just drop in and say, "Hi, we're here for dinner"? She probably had to go to the market. It's not like she had a refrigerator stocked for events like that, because they didn't have refrigerators or ice boxes or anything like that then. And believe it or not, she was fixing lunch or supper for 14, 15, 16 people, and she did not even have a microwave in the house. How do you do that? I don't know. And then no one is lifting a finger to help her, especially the one that should be helping her, her sister Mary. But Martha was doing what she loved to do. She was a doer. In John chapter 12, after the resurrection of Lazarus, we find another dinner party, and it's Mary and Martha, and they have Jesus. Instead of a funeral dinner, it's a resurrection dinner, all right? And they're celebrating, and it just makes this note, and Martha was serving the meal. That's what Martha did. That's how she served. That's how she wanted to please Jesus. But as she looked at things, she couldn't help herself. Now, I thought about this. I think it reflects the good relationship she had with Jesus, because she says to Jesus, "Jesus, tell her to get up and help me." Now, how many other people in the New Testament went up and told Jesus what he was supposed to do? Not very many that I can think of. But to me, it was just that family said it. It's like, "Jesus, come on, look at Mary." And Jesus calmly responds to her in verse 41 to 42. But the Lord said to her, "My dear Martha, you're worried and upset over all these details. There is only one thing worth being concerned about. Mary has discovered it, and it will not be taken away from her. And the story ends abruptly. And we don't know what happens. We don't know if Mary stomped back in the kitchen and said, "Fine, I'll fix the supper," start slamming hands around everywhere. Or she could have just yelled out there, "All right, you guys, just call Uber Eats. If you want to eat supper, just call them. Get whatever you want." You know, we don't know. We don't know if Mary got up and went and helped her. We don't know. But the scene went on. My guess is Mary continued to sit at the feet of Jesus, and Martha went and fixed the meal. But that phrase that Jesus uses there is only one thing worth being concerned about. It's a key phrase. It's translated differently in different translations. The King James says there's only one thing that is needed. Another translation says, but there's only one thing that is necessary. Another translation says, there's only one thing that is essential. All in all, the phrase portrays the concept that this is the most important thing. And Jesus did as Jesus was so much a master at. He captures a teachable moment. Sometimes those teachable moments are the best way to teach. It's not necessarily all the lessons that someone might hear or all the Bible school classes or all that. Sometimes parents especially, sometimes there are things that happen in life, and as you're going through life, it's a teachable moment and maybe the most important moment you'll ever get to teach. And Jesus captures one of those teachable moments. You see, sitting at his feet were the disciples and was Mary. And why point that out? Well, in those days, it was very significant. A rabbi or a teacher, and that's what Jesus was called, anybody that wanted to be one of his disciples, someone that really wanted to learn from him, that phrase was used to sit at their feet. The Apostle Paul uses it in the book of Acts when he's defending himself in one of his trials, and he says, "I sat at the feet of Gamaliel, the great teacher." So it was symbolic. If you were to sit at the feet of the rabbi, you wanted to learn everything you could from him. You wanted to imitate his life. You wanted to have other people recognize, oh, you were a student of such and such rabbi. So Mary chooses to sit at the feet, to say, I want to learn from you, Jesus. And the greatest compliment to any teacher was that the student would live out the life of the rabbi. So here we have Jesus teaching, Mary listening. And the goal of a disciple was to become a living example of the words of the teacher. Now, he wasn't telling Martha that he didn't appreciate her, that he didn't want to eat what she was going to have. He was hungry. He wanted lunch too. But he seizes this moment, and he makes that statement. Only one thing worth being concerned about. What if our number one priority was to be a living example of the words and the life of Jesus? What difference does that make? How does that happen? Well, I could give you a checklist, right? You know, go through the checklist. Well, you got to go to church at least 3 times a week. You got to read 13 chapters of the Bible every day and memorize 20 verses. You got to help 42 little old ladies across the street every week. You've got to give to the poor, and the list could go on and on and on, and those things are not bad things, and if you want to do those things, go for it. I encourage you to do that. But I'm not going to give you a list because that's kind of what the Pharisees in the days of Jesus had gotten into. They'd gotten into this list, well, there's this checklist, there's 635 laws, and if I just check off all of them, and if I say the right prayers, and I go through the right motion, and I do the right things, and I wear the right clothes, and if I look good, then I'm in. And Jesus' number one confrontational group was who? The Pharisees. Because they'd missed the point. So what does it then mean to be a disciple of Jesus? Let me throw out some ideas. To be a disciple of Jesus, you've got to make room for Him. You've got to make room for Him. Have you ever noticed how easy it is to accumulate stuff? Now, my guess is a lot of you here moved from up north some point in your life. Some of you may have lived here all your life. Or maybe you've moved from one house to another. And my guess is, without taking a survey, is that at least 80-90% of you had a garage sale in the part of that move. Because you went through this stuff and you thought, why in the world do I have this for? I don't really need this. This funny story, when we moved down here from Illinois, someone in the church had given us this TV, and it was a huge 32-inch Sony Trinitron, all right? And that thing, it was so heavy, literally, it could be an anchor for a battleship. I mean, and I am not going to haul that thing all the way down to Florida and have to put up with it anymore. So I didn't have a garage. I gave it away. This worker came by to do something. I said, you like a TV? And yeah. And I said, all right, it's yours. Carry it out of here, you know. Well, you had to have 3 guys to carry the thing out, you know. So we get down here. We buy our house. It's a turnkey house. All the furniture, everything's in it. Guess what is in the living room that they actually... They had built a whole entertainment center around this same exact TV. 32-inch Sony Trinitron Anchor TV, all right? I gave it away to a worker also. We accumulate stuff, and stuff takes up our lives, and it gets cluttered and all kinds of things. What's the point? Mary and Martha invited Jesus into their home. They opened their home to Him. Here's the point. Sometimes we fill our lives with so much stuff that we don't have room for God. Be it our schedules, be it our hobbies, be it our job, fill in the blanks. There's all kinds of things that can get in the way of making room for God. If you've never made room for Him in your life as far as accepting Him as Lord and Savior, then I really encourage you to think about that and pray about that, and love to sit down and talk with you about what that means to become a Christian, to accept Him, and to say, Lord, I want you to forgive my sins, and I want you to help me live a life that will be a blessing to others. If you've not made that first step, then please consider that, pray about it, think about it. It's the most important decision you'll ever make. But there may be others of us here that have done that, and yet over the years, just like all that junk that accumulates in the garage or accumulates in the closets or accumulates in the patio or wherever it might be, we let stuff come in, and pretty soon we don't have room for God in our life. I don't know how many times I've known people that, my job got it, so busy that I just had to, work a lot, and either one or two things happened. They say, well, I had to start working on Sundays, and I just started doing that. Or they said, I work 6 days a week, and the only day I have for myself was Sunday, so that's why I don't go to church. They crowded their life so full that God crowded them out. They let God be crowded out of their life. Families nowadays, it's a challenge if you have kids that want to be involved in extracurricular activities. I remember the first time this happened, I took my daughter to an ice skating lesson. This is up in Springfield, Illinois. And I'm sitting there in the bleachers while they're doing their thing. And I look at this flyer, and they were having a hockey tourney for a junior hockey league on Easter Sunday morning. Like, whoa. And I wouldn't go through all the lists, but if the kids are involved in things, Sunday is no longer reserved. It's the time to do activities. A lot of junk out there that can get in the way. And sometimes we've just got to make room for Jesus in our lives. Second thing, to be a disciple, you got to put the big rocks in first. One thing I'll guarantee you, if you have priorities, you're going to have distractions. It's just part of the game. Now, sometimes Judy has a priority for me. It's you need to go out there and clean up your workbench in your garage, all right? And I say, okay, I'll do that. And I'll go outside, I'll go in the garage, and then all of a sudden, if my garage is on the east side of the garage, or my workbench is on the east side, and on the west side of the garage, there's this mysterious pool. It's my fishing boat. It's in all my fishing stuff, you know. And as crazy thing happens, you go out there, workbench, oh, but man, I need to restring these rods, or well, I need to check the oil, or well, there's this bolt I need to fix, and I can spend, you know, an hour or two doing stuff to all the fishing stuff I enjoy, and Judy will come out and say, what happened? Well, I got distracted. But to my defense, fishing, I go out, I work hard to bring food, put it on the table, support my family, right? Guys, help me out here. Is that right? Yeah, okay, you know. Well, priorities. As soon as we set priorities, we're going to have things that come along and try to distract us from that. Sometimes it could be hobbies. Sometimes it can be your phone, the computer. I don't know what it is in your life, but what is it that's edging out worship of God? What is it that's edging out taking a few moments to open His Word? What is it that's edging out spending some time in prayer? Hear the words of Jesus. King James says it this way, Martha, Martha, there is only one thing that is needed. Say that, only insert your own name. Jeff, but there's only one thing that is needed. You see, I'm more of a Martha. I'm a doer. I like to, get this done and be busy and do this and do this and do this and do this. And I need to be reminded, Jeff, there's something that's much more essential than that. To be a disciple, you got to put the big rocks in first. One final thing. To be a disciple, write a story that's worth telling. 2 weeks ago on Wednesday night, I mentioned before that Judy and we work with the elementary kids on Wednesday night, and I take the 3rd through 5th graders, and this was the story for the lesson that night. And we got out the Bibles and had them look up the Scriptures. We're teaching them how to actually look up the Scriptures, and we read the story. And then after we did that, I said to them, all right, why do you think that story is in the Bible? There's a lot of stories, and there's probably a lot of other things Jesus did, and a lot of important things He did. Why in the world do you think that story is in the Bible? And they waited for a moment, and then one little girl raises her hand, and she says, because He wanted to teach us something. I said, that's right. And then you know what the next question was. Well, what is it that He wanted to teach us? Why is that story there? Wasn't about a big miracle. Wasn't walking on the water. Wasn't feeding 5,000. It wasn't healing the lame or the blind or some of those amazing things that Jesus did. Why a story about a dinner, a lunch, and two sisters, and one of them was upset? I think it's all wrapped up in that one phrase. Martha, Martha, there's one thing that is essential, and that's sitting at my feet to be a disciple so that you can live out who I am to others. What story will be told about you? See, they chose to tell this story about Mary and Martha, and that was the story. What story are you writing that's worth telling? I don't know about you, but I've been there, and I imagine you have also, at a memorial service. And I don't know how many I've participated in, but right on this stage, people stand up and they'll tell all kinds of stories about the person that had passed away and that they're remembering. And some of those stories will make people cry, and some of them will make them laugh. And it's just kind of a neat gathering as it focuses everybody on that person's life. And you see a lot of shaking of heads and say, yeah, I remember that. What's your story that people are going to tell? When they look back at you, what's that story that they're going to tell? Is it going to be a story that makes a difference in the lives of others? So when you write your story, make sure you put the big rocks in first.